Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Global Cooperation House. This is an event by the Janki Foundation and the Brahma Kumaris. My name is Sarah Eager. I'm chair of the Janki Foundation. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's event. So the Janki Foundation has always had a long interest in values in healthcare. One of our major projects has been the Values in Healthcare project, which is undergoing a bit of a revival at the moment, and you'll see the big pack at the back. And we launched that at King's College in 2004, I think, so it's got a long history. So it's really interesting to come back to that topic today of reclaiming values. And I think there's a general feeling somehow that it's connected with soul, that somehow those values are connected to something deep and important inside of us, which we might call the spiritual side of ourselves. And there's a bit of a feeling that's been lost in medicine somehow. There's a disconnect, and those things that are really important and valuable to us are not being as represented as much in the work that we do. And there's been a lot of concern about that. So I'm really delighted to introduce our first speaker, who is Paquita de Zulueta. Paquita's been a friend really in doing parallel work for a long, long time. We both were involved in the British Holistic and Medical Association. And for me, the holism, the aspect of holism where it's mind, body and spirit has always been something very inspiring, that it includes the spirit in healthcare. And that's the kind of model of healthcare, or the model of the human predicament, that we both resonate with. And Paquita has worked as an inner London GP and always had an interest in ethics, professional education, migrant health, mental health. She was on Imperial College NHS Trust's Clinical Ethics Committee and the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, and was also the GP for Grenfell. So you've been very close, I think, Paquita, to the whole Grenfell situation and the losses and grief that people went through with that. Very interested in medical education through Schwartz Round facilitators, and has recently revived and set up this charity Human Values in Healthcare Forum, and is also a compassion therapist. So many, many strings to her bow, and someone who resonates deeply, I think, with the values of Janki Foundation and spirituality. So we're delighted to invite Paquita to come and share her thoughts, because as well as the values and the compassion, I think there's a growing interest now in what happens when there's a disconnect, when there's a dissonance, when those values and the organisation you work in don't share the same values. What effect does that have on you and the way you practice? And so I think Paquita's going to take us on a journey through those concepts and ideas today. So welcome, Paquita. Thank you.
Lovely to see you all, and a great honour to be invited. Just to say, so I'm somebody that is quite visual, so I need to kind of look at what I'm saying, so you'll have to forgive me. So I've got my little iPad here, which has the slides, because otherwise I thought I'm going to be just twisting my head all the time, and that won't be very good for me or for you. So I'm going to talk about, let's just see if we can get, if this is working. Yes, so that's great. As we said, about restoring human values and reclaiming soul in healthcare. And I'm sure, I know that you have, I'm sure, explored a great deal what we mean by values, but it quite often gets hijacked, I've noticed, particularly by politicians, and they talk about British values. And you think, actually, that's not quite where I stand. So And so it can be sort of misused. But I think for all of us, it really is what gives meaning and purpose to our lives, what really matters. And it engages both our feelings, our emotions, and our thoughts, if you like, heart, mind, and soul. And quite often we discover them at sort of crucial moments, difficult moments even, and then we reflect on them. And I think that they're reflected very much by what we do, not what we say. And they are deep-seated, but as we evolve and live our lives, they can change. So, yeah, and then what about values in organizations? They're very much the heart of an organization, aren't they? They create the culture. And if they're shared and aligned, we kind of feel that sense of collectivity, of solidarity. And certainly studies have shown that if individuals are working in healthcare, they tend to be, surprise, surprise, socially driven values such as altruism and care. And if we look at the NHS constitution, it talks about compassion and respect and commitment to quality, inclusivity, everyone counts. But is this what, when you read and hear, quite often we hear something very different of what healthcare professionals and patients are experiencing. And I think we heard that quite a bit before the assisted dying bill, these terrible stories of people suffering neglect and injustice. Aidan Halligan was a surgeon actually, but a champion for compassion. And he wrote a paper on the importance of values in healthcare. And as he said, they cannot be underestimated. The graces of civilization underpin the attributes of compassion, caring, honesty, good communication, and trust. But as he said, we struggle to those values to survive in a culture which is overmanaged and underled. If I'm going too fast, do tell me, and I'll slow down. So what about the soul? And I know Sister Janki is going to talk about this, so but it is interesting that we hear a lot about soul music, soul food, the soul. A colleague of mine, Rupal Shah, has written a book called Fighting for the Soul of General Practice. So we understand what it means, but it's not a concept that's easy to define. And Ian McGilchrist, who you might know from The Divided Brain, he says actually that's probably the whole point, is that it is implicit. It is something that once you start to analyze it and use your left brain, it loses its meaning. And certainly in modern medicine, it's not fashionable, and medicine, one might argue, is dominated a lot by scientific materialism and even bureaucracy. But we do know when something feels soulless. We feel that alienation, that sense of meaninglessness, rootlessness, even an inhumanity. And Arthur Kleinman, who was a psychiatrist, some of you might know, and also an anthropologist, and wrote quite often in The Lancet these beautiful articles and also books, the narrative, illness narratives. He describes when he was a young psychiatrist that he was treating a veteran from the war who'd felt that he had committed a crime a crime against humanity. He'd committed some terrible thing, and he also had PTSD, post-traumatic stress. And so he got better from the PTSD, but he told Kleinman, I still feel my soul hasn't been healed. And so later, Kleinman realized what he meant, and he describes it, as you read here, a perduring moral and emotional core to his being, a vital human essence. And I think that conveys that sense of soul, a spiritual touchstone that cannot be conveyed by technical psychiatric terms. Compassion systems, I know you've had a talk last year with Michael West, with whom I work and much admire, but just to remind you that compassionate leadership is not just in the top, it's got to be throughout the organization at all levels. And compassion to healthcare must be for those who work in the healthcare context, who are the healthcare workers, as well as patients. And I know that Sarah's done a lot of work on this. And that we need to treat an organization as a human living system and not as a machine. And I could talk quite a lot about that and how we still employ the Frederick Taylor way of looking. He was an engineer and wrote a paper in 1912 called The Scientific Management of Organizations. And we're still employing very much his methodology in NHS systems. And Michael has written a lovely book called Compassionate Leadership, and I've written a couple of articles as well. So this is a theory which was actually brought up by, again, two psychiatrists called Ryan and Decky, called self-determination theory, but in the year 2000. But actually it's been revisited and it's stood the test of time. And they looked at flourishing at work, but you could say also flourishing in general. And I have this acronym, PRAM, which is reminding ourselves that you need purpose and meaning, that as human beings we're meaning-making individuals, and with meaning, and that also includes spirituality. We need good, positive relationships, and we need to have a sense of agency, of autonomy. So that doesn't mean necessarily the kind of selfish individual autonomy, but a sense that you have an agency and some control over what you're doing. And then mastery, which is again about craft, about really enjoying doing something well. And if those things are absent, okay. And then just moving on from that is just thinking about motivation. And quite often we hear about incentivizing. It's very fashionable, and that kind of carrots and stick model. So, and that may work for simple things, but not really for more complex human in the human system model. So. And also, as we found in general practice, that it can lead to gaming and cheating and envy, and demotivating actually undermines intrinsic motivation. And intrinsic motivation, you don't really need external rewards. You get a sense of joy and fulfillment from the work itself. And as they say here, it's best for creative, relational, or noble tasks. And it's linked to professionalism. But what if these are absent? What if you haven't got meaning? If work feels meaningless, you're doing a lot of bureaucratic stuff that just doesn't connect with what you want to do. Your relationships are disrupted, there's very little continuity, you do short shifts. Your autonomy, you're told what to do, you have less and less sense of agency. And mastery just doesn't count, it's not important. And that sense of accumulative wisdom. So I know, again, you've heard about burnout, so I won't spend long on this, but just again to remind how that very much connects with burnout. That sense of loss of control, too much workload, a lot of it paperwork. That was a key thing. Loss of a sense of community, of teams, continuity, and just not enough time and space for those important conversations. And then not being validated for what you do and experiencing bullying and lack of gratitude, and that was very important during the pandemic. And then moving on, so one of the key things was values, and there was a really interesting study in New Zealand with more than 1,000 healthcare professionals of different disciplines quite recently. And they actually explored values, because quite often people explore well-being or burnout, but they actually looked at values. And what they found was that if people were working in environments where they felt that their values were not consonant, and they were discrepant with those of the organization, that it had all these negative effects. So the ability to provide compassionate care, the job satisfaction, more burnout, more absenteeism, and early retirement intention, and we're certainly seeing that. And that these lead to, obviously, an attrition, lower productivity, which people get very excited about, higher costs, and worse patient care and outcomes. And so what these researchers conclude is that healthcare organizations and policymakers and government agencies, they must critically assess how their processes, their practices, their so-called performance indicators, how they allocate resources, contribute to these discrepancies and begin to make changes so that they can be in line with one another. So consonance between values will lead to better employee performance, professional well-being and patient care, and thereby lower costs, and lead to more efficient healthcare systems. So it's sort of quite obvious in a way, and yet not always easy for it to happen. And then there was an interesting paper with nurses, a qualitative study, and they thought, well, do professional and personal values differ significantly? And in this study, they found they didn't. But in some cases, there was another study where they found that it did, that was a cause for moral distress, which I'll talk about in a moment. But in fact, if one digs deep, it was quite often that the nurses felt that they were having to do what the doctors decided, and they didn't feel that was right because they were much closer to the patient. So they saw that as personal, but you could argue that was also professional. So looking at moral distress, which is a term we're hearing much more, especially since the pandemic, it was originally defined by Andrew Jamerton in 1984, when one knows what's the right thing to do, but institutional constraints make it nearly impossible to pursue the right course of action. And then since then, there's been a huge amount of literature, particularly in the nursing ethics literature, but also now, especially since the pandemic, in the medical literature as well. So it's a useful but contested concept, and is still undergoing kind of iterations and development. And so, as we've said, it's sort of as being prevented by internal constraints from acting the way that aligns with our values, but it seems the right thing to do, and you can't do it. But it also can be that you're not sure what is the right thing to do. It can be a moral perplexity. And as we've said, it arises from lack of power agency, barriers, just not enough resources. You may not feel you're educated enough in that particular field. And it's so very much linked to the nature of the work. And it can lead to feelings of blame and self-guilt, isolation, and then anxiety and depression, and even PTSD. But in itself, and I think that's really important, it isn't a mental illness. And Renos Papadopoulos, who I know actually and is a family therapist and works a lot with asylum seekers and refugees, and has written a lovely book called Moral Injury and Beyond, Understanding Human Anguish and Healing Traumatic Wounds. And I'll talk about what he says, but he sees that danger of making it into a psychological individual problem. So moral injury, again, we hear quite a bit of moral injury, and I went to the Wounded Healers Conference, and there Claire Gerardo was saying that GPs, most of them are suffering from moral injury. So I think one needs to just drill down a little bit what we mean by it. It was first coined in the military context with veterans and by Shea. And he describes it as being having an existential dimension, that your whole assumptive world, as it's called, is shattered, a disruption of your framework, moral framework, and how you see yourself and the world. And Nancy Sherman, who is actually a virtue-based philosopher and who worked with veterans, also says is when somebody suffers from severe moral conflict, trauma, or anguish to do with real or apparent transgressions and falling short of your own personal and professional ideals. And then the other thing is that it can be a cumulative thing, that several incidents of moral distress can then lead to this crescendo effect and lead to moral injury. And then we've talked a little bit about moral identity, it's been mentioned, and just to see it, Cahill, Moyes and Dugdale describe it as being that our moral identities evolve in our relationships with others and as we create our story of ourselves in a narrative. And it's a becoming, a dynamic and continually shaped by dialogue with others, but greater once you have that sense of coherence, you have greater moral clarity and you can exercise your agency better. And then finally, moral residue is when you've actually undertaken some action and it was the best you could do at the time, but you feel somehow you've betrayed yourself, you're not happy with it. When you've compromised yourself or allowed yourself to be compromised and it threatens or betrays your deeply held, cherished beliefs and values. So as I've said, there is this danger of psychologizing moral distress and injury. And as Papadopoulos says, the sense of right and wrong is an integral part of our settled sense of who we are and how we relate to ourselves and to the world around us. And once the resulting disorientation is limited to psychiatric medical pathology, then there's no consideration can possibly be given to other forms of disorientation, such as moral issues, and even less to the possibility of growth and transformation. So I'll talk about that in a moment. So let's get to something more positive and think about moral resilience, which is now being developed. Somebody called Cinder Rushton, who works in the States and is by background a nurse, is doing a lot of research on this. And there's a realization that actually we need to think more about that rather than always looking at it in a sort of deficit-based approach and looking more at strengths. And she Lachman describes it as an ability to deal with an ethically adverse situation, but without the lasting effects of distress and moral residue. And it requires morally courageous action and getting support and doing the right thing. And then Rushton describes it as preserving or restoring integrity in response to moral adversity, including situations that include complexity, confusion, distress, or setbacks. And this was a really interesting study which actually was interviewing both clinicians and non-clinicians, and so that included social workers and chaplains. And they were asked, really, what do you see as moral resilience? And they felt that integrity, that sense of being able to remain true to your values was very important, and something called relational integrity, which was being open and willing to engage with others and listening to them and seeing how one could meet them halfway, but without compromising what you felt was important. And then this idea of buoyancy, which is the ability to bounce back, but perhaps more working through these issues and emerging stronger at the end. And they talk, and I'm sure this is something you're very familiar with, self-regulation, being able to manage their emotions using often with mindfulness, self-stewardship, realizing your boundaries, what your limits are, and moral efficacy, being able to be very clear and articulate in what you think is the right thing. So, and there's also a comment that it involves building and fostering your individual capacity, but also developing systems that support a culture of ethical practice. And then we allied to that, we hear of moral courage. And Aristotle, who's from 2,500 years ago, talks about, and we still use a lot of his thinking in virtue ethics, is that idea that it's a balance between being rash and being cowardly, so the golden mean. And it means acting moral courage according to your values, despite they might be a risk to yourself. And there's skills required, as we've mentioned before, being able to calm and soothe yourself, being able to positively reframe, see the good in what you're doing and what the outcome might be, and also discernment, able to evaluate the risks involved, have contingency plans if things don't work out, being able to get support from others, and being able to be assertive. So there are quite a lot of skills involved, and being able to negotiate, maybe nonviolent communication. So those are all important. And of course, if one's acting for others, vulnerable others, that gives one that strength and motivation to be courageous. But it has been criticized because the idea is that it seems to be too individualistic. And you may retain your integrity, but what about others? Why aren't you challenging the system that has led to this moral distress and injury? And then thinking of whistleblowers, just if one just looks back, and even now, despite the duty of candor and so on, and the support that's supposed to be given to whistleblowers who believe that patient care is compromised, it's still not a happy story, and they often suffer. And so Michael Traynor, who's written, actually this is his book on critical resilience, where he has a rather powerful looking nurse on the front, but he's of a nursing background, and he believes that nurses should become more informed about the systems they work in, and they should form mutually supportive groups and take action rather than just complain or acquiesce. And not blame themselves either, and try and use creative energy to change the system. So as we've said, we need to go beyond the individual and focus on context, because the sources of moral resilience must be seen, and injury must be seen, as fundamentally social. And a communal approach is required, and I'm sure you do a lot of this, of ethical reflection and reaffirmation of professionalism. So we need to find ways that mitigate the social conditions that give rise to moral injury. We can't, hospitals and even general practice are places of suffering, and you have to be able to manage that in a way that you retain your integrity and your compassion, and that's something that can't be changed, but it's actually working on the moral injury and distress that is preventable that we should be focusing on. So there's this idea of collective moral resilience, which Delgado talks about, which I think is really important. It's that shared capacity within a group that trust each other, that connected to each other, and through that being able to challenge ethically challenging situations, being able to work through them and share them and thinking about them, and sustaining, restoring moral integrity in response to moral suffering. And it's very important for survivors as well to express their solidarity and cohesion, and being able to coordinate and draw on collective sources of support to deal with adversity. And certainly after Grenfell, I found out that I ran a seminar with them, with some of the survivors and bereaved, and said, what is it that helps to keep you going? And they had three things which they said. One was each other, their relationships with each other, supporting each other. The second was their faith, which was very important to them. And their third was being able to help others, doing something for others. And that included trying to get justice and to make sure that this never happened again to other people. So let's think about repair. And there's a lovely kintsugi is a lovely Japanese art of repair. So this is a broken vase, but it's been repaired with gold. And the idea is that you make something that's more beautiful at the end. And you accept transience and imperfection and the beauty of simplicity. And we are repairing animals, we are repairing creatures. All the time we're repairing relationships, our bodies self-repair in many ways. And there's a lovely book by Elizabeth Spurman on repair. And also, and I'll talk about more, Margaret Urban Walker has written a whole book on it and extensively explores it. And Susan Shale actually interviewed healthcare leaders about moral repair, and what they see it is preventative as well as reparative, aiming to re-establish a sense of equilibrium between individuals and between people. And Margaret Urban Walker talks about it as being a common perspective that links them to the basic task of replenishing trust and hope on which relationships, moral relationships, depend. And she has these key principles that are needed, and this was very relevant, I think, after the pandemic for people who suffered immense loss and moral injury. I think a lot of the nurses and doctors felt terrible not allowing relatives to be with their dying loved ones. There were many things that were very, very difficult for them. And it's this idea, and again with Grenfell, of respecting that person as an equal, and the authority and validity of shared norms. And that means that we share the idea that being lied to is wrong, that being injured, that being neglected is wrong. And recognizing the injury and taking full responsibility for it, no ifs and buts, and that there is a remedy due. And again, and rectifying, taking steps to prevent recurrence. And for example, for the Grenfell survivors, having this inflammable cladding, which was very, very key to the terrible fire, not that it is removed from from other buildings so that other people are not put at risk. And again, this hasn't still happened in many cases. And that anger is justified, and one shouldn't try and rush recovery. There, you're okay now. So, and in injuring others, we should experience sorrow and regret, and it must be authentic. And I think, again, there was quite a contrast with how the politician said sorry, but actually it wasn't a sorry. I don't know if you remember, but so moral repair, it needs a community. It needs a repairing community, and recognizing that it's not individuals, and that it doesn't. You can repair on your own, but it can't be entirely a solitary practice. That it needs the community and the transformation of identity in the community. And it's a summons to solidarity, to collective action, and to advocacy for systemic change to improve working conditions and the health of patients. And that when you do that, it's empowering and therapeutic for everybody. And then I've talked about hope, and there's these wonderful books on hope. And they all very much say the same kind of thing, that it's about being creative and resourceful as well, and taking action. And Rachel Clark spoke at the Wounded Healers Conference, and she says hope is like love. It's a doing word. It's created by engagement and action. It's built from effort and not bestowed. And because I think there's Hannah Arendt, who's a famous philosopher who escaped from Nazi Germany. She was Jewish. She felt that hope sometimes can be quite passive. Oh, I hope that things will get better. And you may disagree with this, but she felt that actually that could be harmful, and that she felt it needed, again, action. It needed to be translated into what she called natality. And then finally, just talking about post-traumatic growth, again on a positive note. I've used this image here of the pearl because the pearl starts off as a bit of grit in the shell, and with time and the secretions of the organism, it becomes this beautiful, lovely pearl. And it has these 5 domains. So deeper relationships we've mentioned, being open to new possibilities, being willing to change, and that greater sense of personal efficacy and strength, a stronger sense of spirituality, and a greater appreciation of life. And certainly I've I had a long time ago, I had a very life-threatening condition, something called streptococcal fasciitis, where I nearly died. And I do remember exactly that feeling of immense gratitude, but also of being stronger and less frightened of dying, actually. And that greater sense of being part of a greater whole, and really valuing my relationships with my family and with my friends. So, but Papadopoulos actually says why it's not post. It actually is during adversity we can develop resourcefulness, we can develop strengths. And he describes what he calls adversity-activated development. All the new strengths, positive qualities, developments, improvements, all the constructive functions and behaviors and relationships are activated as a direct result of being exposed to adversity. And there was a very interesting study, and he was involved in this work, looking at, they tried to interview it was actually a questionnaire-based study, but they asked people who were actually working at the time of COVID, they looked at what were the predictors for post-traumatic growth, and there are ways you can measure that. And what they found was there were these 5 key things. So one was being able to reflect positively, not being self-forgiving, being self-affirming on things that had happened, and ethnicity. And what's interesting there is that although these groups, Black and Asian groups that they describe, were more at risk, as we know, of COVID, more at risk of dying or being severely ill, they knew that, but they still had stronger post-traumatic growth. And they believed that this was due to the fact that more of them had a faith and that they had a stronger sense of community. And they also found that if they were allowed to develop new skills and knowledge, that their professional development was attended to, that again made them feel stronger and better. And then connecting, obviously, with friends and family was really important. And feeling supported not just by lower level management or their peers and colleagues, but also by senior management. And that gets back to, compassionate leadership. But also by people in the United Kingdom, and if you remember, there was that clapping. But then after a while, that changed, and they were then subjected to sometimes to aggression and hostility, which was very hurtful for them. And also, I think they didn't like so much this idea of being hero worshipped, because they felt they're ordinary, vulnerable people that are just trying to do their best. So I'm going to conclude now, and just conclude that saying that restoring and sustaining values in healthcare needs a collective moral resilience, collaboration, and systemic change. And the moral repairs happens within a community and won't happen unless those root causes of moral injury are addressed, if you remember those 7 principles. And that adversity can lead to positive transformation and growth. And then just something to say that, and one of the things that we've found that helps moral resilience is being able to talk with colleagues together about the situations you've encountered, the moral challenges and dilemmas, and working through them in a safe moral space. And so just to mention that the Human Values Healthcare Forum, we are running every month at lunchtime an hourly session, interdisciplinary, everyone's welcome, free, where we have 2 facilitators, one who's trained and qualified in ethics, and the other who's worked with groups in education. So I'll leave this out on the table there. So if you want to sign up, by all means do. And it's got a QR code, so you can find out more about it on the website. And then just to mention the human values, what we're about. It was actually set up in the 1980s by doctors and social scientists who felt that this was really important. And then it went through various iterations, and now I've reignited it with friends and colleagues as a charity. And our key mission is to rehumanize healthcare. But we do it very much by supporting and collaborating with others who share the same aims and values as us. And we also look at practices and policies that dehumanize. And we aim to be a community of practice and provide reflective and educational spaces. And we run conferences and a replenishing day once a year, and looking at ethical issues and challenges in everyday healthcare, as well as ethical social impacts of scientific technological developments. And our values include wisdom, compassion, integrity, inclusivity, courage, and justice. And so that's it. So I don't know how we are for time. I think it's within 1 minute of. But thank you very much for listening.